All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time, we're tackling the book of Joshua. Basically, the Israelites are finally entering the promised land.
Yeah.
Generations in the making. But it's not exactly a walk in the park, is it?
No, not at all. It's really fascinating how the story picks up right where Exodus leaves off. You've got the Israelites escaping slavery, wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and now they're on the verge of actually inheriting this land God promised their ancestors way back. Talk about a legacy.
It is. Okay, so to really get the impact of Joshua, we need to back up a bit. Refresh my memory. What were the key events that lead up to this moment?
Well, it all begins with Abraham. He's like the OG, the patriarch of the whole Israelite nation, right? God makes this covenant with him, promises him like descendants as countless as the stars in a land, flowing with milk and honey. But then fast forward centuries and you've got the Israelites enslaved in Egypt.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where Moses steps in, leads
Yeah.
them to freedom with those, epic plagues, the Red Sea parting, unbelievable stuff. And then they get the law at Mount Sinai, really cementing that covenant with God. So where does Joshua fit into all of this?
So Joshua, he becomes Moses' right-hand man during all those years wandering in the wilderness. And then God chooses him to lead the Israelites into the promised land after Moses passes. It's like passing the torch, but with a huge emphasis on fulfilling God's will and keeping those covenant promises front and center.
Okay, so now we've got Joshua in charge. They reach the Jordan River. That's the boundary to the promised land, right? And boom, what happens? Another miraculous parting of the waters.
It really is like an echo of the Red Sea crossing, isn't it? Such a powerful image. It's like God showing them and us that he's faithful, he's powerful, and he can overcome any obstacle. The video we're looking at actually puts those two events side by side. It's a really cool visual reminder that God's power is consistent across generations. He was with them then, and he's with them now.
Definitely. It's like a divine seal of approval on Joshua's leadership.
Yeah.
But it's more than just spectacle, right? What happens once they're actually in the land?
Well, this is where it gets even more interesting. Once they're in the land, they renew the covenant through circumcision and Passover. It's like a reset button for this new generation, entering a new phase. The video makes this point that these rituals are all about purifying and consecrating themselves before they really take possession of the land.
So it's like they're stepping into their inheritance, claiming their identity as God's people. But before they can really settle in, there are some conflicts to deal with, right?
Exactly. And right off the bat, Joshua has this encounter with this mysterious warrior. And the warrior asks him, point blank, are you for us or for our enemies? It's a huge moment. Joshua's answer shows us that the real battle isn't just against the Canaanites. It's about being aligned with God's will above all else.
Wait, the warrior asks whose side he's on. That's pretty intense. I'm guessing this warrior isn't just any soldier.
You got it. The video explains that this warrior is actually the commander of the Lord's army, basically an angel. And when Joshua asks whose side he's on, get this, the angel says, neither. He's there to do what God wants, not just take sides in a human conflict.
Whoa, okay, that adds a whole other dimension to this story. It's not as simple as good guys versus bad guys. It's about, understanding God's bigger plan.
Exactly. And that really sets the stage for the battles that come next, because we're not just talking military strategy here. It's divine intervention, the consequences of obeying or disobeying. Like, remember the Battle of Jericho?
Oh, yeah. That's the one where they just march around the city blowing trumpets and the walls crumble. It's straight out of a movie.
And the video emphasizes that this victory happens because they follow God's instructions to the letter. No swords, no battering rams, just obedience, just faith. Pretty wild.
Talk about a powerful reminder that God can work in some incredible ways when we trust him and follow his lead. But I'm guessing it wasn't always that smooth, right?
You're right about that. The video goes on to the Battle of Ai. And there, the Israelites experience a crushing defeat. Why? Because one man, Achan, disobeys God's command and takes some of the loot for himself. It just goes to show that even when there are these amazing victories happening, personal choices have huge consequences.
It's a good warning, isn't it? Obedience isn't just about rules. It's about our hearts being aligned with what God wants and understanding the impact of what we do. What about the people who weren't in the battles, though? Were all the Canaanites considered enemies?
That's where it gets even more complicated. You have the Gibeonites. They were Canaanites, but they saw how powerful the God of Israel was. So they decided to make a treaty with the Israelites, even though they were supposed to be enemies.
So even in the middle of these conquests, you have moments of peace, alliances forming. It's fascinating. What made these Gibeonites want to make a treaty? Were they truly convinced about God, or was it a strategic move to save their own skin.
Well, if you go by the text, they actually tricked the Israelites into the treaty. They pretended to be from far away, showed up with worn-out clothes, moldy bread, the whole bit.
Wow, crafty. But eventually the Israelites figured it out, right? What happened then?
They kept their word. They honored the treaty even though they were tricked into it. But they did make the Gibeonites their servants, doing things like chopping wood and carrying water.
Interesting. It sounds like even when dealing with potential enemies, they had a sense of justice, of keeping their promises.
For sure. The video points this story out as an example of, well, how God's grace and mercy can reach even those who might not seem to deserve it. It really makes you think about the complexities of war and peace, and how God's plan can work in surprising ways, even through trickery and human failings.
This is already a lot to unpack. We've got miracles, consequences, unexpected alliances, and we're just getting started.
There's definitely more to the book of Joshua than just battles and conquests. It's about faith, obedience, leadership, and, well, how God interacts with us. One of the toughest things about this whole story, honestly, is the violence. I mean, you read about cities being destroyed, entire populations wiped out. It's hard to square that with, the idea of a God who's loving and merciful.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging aspect. A lot of people struggle with that, especially reading the Old Testament.
Yeah.
What does the video have to say about it?
It's pretty upfront about it, actually. It really emphasizes that you have to look at these events in their historical and cultural context. So the Canaanite culture, at least how the Bible describes it, was full of things the Israelites saw as horrific. Child sacrifice, idol worship, things like that. The video suggests that God's judgment was aimed at those practices, protecting the Israelites from being influenced by them.
So it's presenting it as, well, divine judgment against a culture that was, from their perspective, morally corrupt. But still, even with that context, it's hard to grasp that level of violence.
I agree. And honestly, it's important to admit that this is a really tough topic. There aren't easy answers. The video acknowledges that. But it also encourages us to remember that what God ultimately wants is redemption, is restoration, even in the middle of judgment.
That's a good point. It's not just destruction for its own sake. It's about making space for something new, a new way of life, a new relationship with God, built on that covenant. And I think that's where the whole dividing up of the land comes in, right?
Yeah.
That idea of inheritance, of establishing themselves in the promised land.
You got it. After those major battles, the video shifts to this detailed account of how they split the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, I know it might seem kind of dry at first, all these lists and boundaries, but it's actually loaded with symbolic meaning.
Okay, explain that to me. What's so symbolic about dividing up land?
Well, think back to that promise God made to Abraham, way back. This division, it's like the fulfillment of that promise. It's about putting down roots, creating a sense of belonging, and really solidifying who they are as a nation.
So they're like finally planting their flag, claiming their place in the world as, God's chosen people. But it's not just about the physical land, is it? There's got to be a spiritual side to this inheritance, too.
Exactly. The video makes that point, too. This land isn't just where they live. It represents their spiritual inheritance as well. It's where they're supposed to live out their covenant with God, build a whole society based on his laws and principles.
So it's like a blueprint for a new kind of nation, founded on, like, faith and obedience to God. But we know, history shows us that they didn't always live up to that, right?
Unfortunately, no. And the video actually foreshadows some of those struggles through the story with Achan, the consequences of his disobedience. It's like a warning that even with the best intentions, human nature can really mess things up.
And that even in this land flowing with milk and honey, there are still battles, temptations, choices to make.
Yeah.
So where does this story go next?
Well, as Joshua gets older, he gives all these speeches to the Israelites. It's like he's echoing Moses, reminding them of all they've been through. It's a powerful call to remember their history, to stay true to God, and to choose the path that leads to blessing instead of disobedience and, ultimately, exile.
It's like he's passing the torch, saying, okay, now it's your turn to take responsibility. What's the, overall message Joshua's trying to leave them with?
It all comes down to choice. He reminds them how faithful God has been, his power, his love, but he's also very clear that their future is in their hands. Will they follow God with everything they've got? or turn away and face the consequences?
That's a big question, isn't it? And it still applies to us today. I mean, we're not conquering lands or anything, but we're constantly faced with choices that affect our lives, our relationship with God.
Exactly. And as the video points out, the book of Joshua isn't just an old history lesson. It's about faith, obedience, leadership, and that power of choice. It makes us look at our own lives and ask, what choices are WE making? What kind of legacy are we building?
It really is amazing how, stories from so long ago can still hit home today. We're not facing armies and dividing up land, but those choices Josh was talking about, those are things we deal with all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Inheriting a promise, facing challenges, staying true to what you believe in when everything around you is different. That's stuff we all deal with.
One thing that stuck out to me was how the video really highlighted those smaller details, the circumcision and Passover rituals, for example. At first you might think, oh, those are just religious practices, but they actually represent something way deeper.
Totally. It's about rededication, renewing themselves, connecting back to who they are at their core. It's like hitting the reset button before you start a new chapter.
Yeah.
And there's a powerful message there for us too, What are the things we do in our lives that help us reconnect with our purpose, our values? What helps us hit that reset button?
Now, that is a great question. It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day stuff and lose sight of the big picture. But that idea of intentionally taking a pause to get back to center, we could all do that.
Yeah. And you know what else really resonated with me? The whole theme of obedience and what happens when you disobey. The video doesn't shy away from the fact that bad choices have consequences, even for, God's chosen people.
Yeah. HN taking that forbidden loot, that's a pretty stark example. Our actions have an impact. It's like a ripple effect. One choice can affect not just you, but a whole community.
Right. And it also shows that even when we mess up, there's still forgiveness, redemption.
Yeah.
The Israelites, they eventually repented, faced the consequences of HN's choice, and they moved forward.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about, owning your mistakes, learning, and still trying to live in that covenant relationship with God. It's a journey with ups and downs.
And that's what makes the ending of Joshua so powerful. He gives that big speech, reminding them of all God has done. And then he lays it out there, the choice. Serve God or turn away.
And he's very clear about what comes with each choice, too. Blessing for obedience, exile if they turn away. Pretty big contrast.
It is. But it's also a powerful reminder that we have a choice. We have that power. And those choices, they shape not just us, but the legacy we leave behind. The video actually quotes Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve.
But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.
Powerful stuff, and a question that honestly still echoes today. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Joshua, what's one thing you hope people listening will take away from this?
For me, it's to go read the book of Joshua again. See how these ancient stories connect with your life in Nebuchadnezzar. It's a book full of adventure, faith, some really tough questions, but also hope, redemption, and how lasting God's promises are.
Well said. I think we've given everyone a lot to think about. Joshua, it's way more than just history. It gets at the heart of what it means to live a life of faith, make hard choices, and build a legacy that matters. Thanks for joining us. Keep exploring.